Welcome back. This is Miss V for the History Vibe, and we're in part 2 of the World War II Begins. Let's talk about the spark of the war and how it got started. So let's go. Alright, so remember before we talked about how Hitler wanted more land and more areas so that he can create this Aryan nation that he postulated or he dreamed about, and he started on this rampage to obtain those lands, invading places like Czechoslovakia, and he was able to annex Austria and so forth, and doing a lot of things that violated the Treaty of Versailles. And eventually he demanded that he wanted the port of Danzig in Poland. So eventually he made this alliance with the Soviet Union to try to gain that port of Danzig, or to try to gain Poland. So when Hitler announced this treaty with the Soviet Union, because the Soviet Union of course is communist and he is anti-communist, the world was really shocked about that announcement. It was like, well, what is he really doing? Or what's going on? And Hitler went in 1939, as you see here, and he invaded Poland. And when he invaded Poland, this is the start, or this is the trigger, the spark that started World War II. Because remember, I mentioned before that Poland was an ally of Britain, because Britain promised that if they got involved in any type of war or was attacked in any way, that Britain would back them up, right? So in this case, because Hitler and German forces went in and invaded Poland, Britain was ready and willing to back up Poland. And as you see here, 2 days later, after September 1st, 1939, Britain and France declared war on Germany, and now we are in a second World War. But that wasn't the only case. That's on the eastern, or the western front, sorry. That was on the western part of it, the western front of this war. In the eastern part of this war, Japan also was involved in the war. The Japanese army also was seeking areas to conquer, right, or to expand their territory. They decided to blow up this small section of the Manchurian Railway, okay? And they justified this incident by taking, military advances, and they figured that Manchuria had a lot of resources that Japan needed. Remember when we talked about the Industrial Revolution and we talked about imperialism and so forth? Mainly most of these countries, they were looking for raw materials and new markets, right? In this case, they literally invaded this area of China called Manchuria, so that they can gain the resources for themselves, so that they, Japan can expand their empire. Okay, so at that point in 1932, as you see here, this happened a little bit earlier before Hitler invaded. It was all going on around the same time as Hitler is building his army and his empire. The Japanese army went in, took over Manchuria, and renamed it Manchukuo. I'm hoping I'm saying that right. I don't think I'm saying that right, but you get the idea. Alright, so as I mentioned, Japan is now heading or growing in their empire and so forth, to the point where the emperor, and this was the emperor at the time, right? Hirohito was the emperor, but because militants in the government and the armed forces themselves, the military itself of Japan, became so powerful, they literally took over Japanese politics, and eventually became the leading force in Japan, and the emperor was more seen as a figurehead, much like how it is today with Britain and the Queen or the King, where they don't influence politics as much. And that was the case here for Emperor Hirohito. Okay, he just didn't have any control. The emperor didn't control the government leaders. He couldn't control his own army. The military just really took over Japan, and that's what led Japan. They were highly militaristic, highly nationalistic in their endeavors, and this is what led them to World War II. Okay. Now, Chiang Kai-shek was once the leader in China. Okay. And Chiang Kai-shek was trying his best to avoid changing China into a communist country. Eventually it does, because if you did research on Mao Zedong, right? We talked about him with the dictators. If you remember, Mao Zedong took over and made China a communist nation or a communist country, right? Okay. But before, Chiang Kai-shek tried his best to avoid conflict with Japan, even though he was still trying to maneuver and keep out the communist Chinese, because he saw the Chinese communists as a big threat to China. But he still had to contend with the Japanese troops that were trying to come in to take over. Remember, again, they were trying to expand the territory, right? Japan. So, as the Japanese troops came in and those clashes between the Chinese and Japanese came about, he tried to appease Japan by allowing Japan to have a governance or sphere of influence over North China. But he realized that those efforts were not going to exist or come into play. So Chiang Kai-shek ended his efforts, or ended his sparring and his warring with the communist Chinese, and focused a lot of his attention towards trying to keep out the Japanese from China. So he formed an alliance with the communist Chinese for the time being, so that he can drive the Japanese out of China. However, that was not the case, because one of the biggest things was called the Rape of Nanjing, and this is where the Japanese army completely destroyed that city and massacred over 100,000 civilians and prisoners of war. As you see here in this picture, all of these are Chinese that have died, or that was massacred in that invasion. Okay. So we are done with 14.1. That is it. Here are two vocabulary words I think that you should really know about, especially as we go forward. Talking about World War II. First word is demilitarization. And that is the dismantling or demobilization of a military. And they deconstruct the military equipment, biological, chemical weapons, anything that is involved with the military. It's demilitarized, it's dismantling. Remember, I mentioned before in the beginning that Germany, through the Treaty of Versailles, was supposed to demilitarize, right? Break down all of their military equipment, and dismantle their military. However, when Hitler broke, or he violated the Treaty of Versailles, he did that through remilitarization, which he rearmed his country by creating that the Air Force, and also installing the military draft. Right, so that was a violation of that treaty by of Versailles through remilitarization. Okay, And you're going to use this particular map here to help you answer those three questions for your applied section. And we'll discuss the answers in class if you need any help with that. All right, so thank you for tuning in, and I will see you in the next video. Peace.